And Shinagogo, baby, what's good, guys? Yoku here, and today we're talking about the secret Power Ranger who traversed the unknown yet again. The wise and sophisticated former anti-entropy sovereign. Entropy? How do you pronounce that word? Whatever. The one who inherits the name of the world. He has saved Earth from annihilation time and time again. But yo, honestly, did you guys know that Welt is actually a storyboard artist? Look, he even gave me his latest works, A Beginner's Guide to Welt, the Power Ranger, and Honkai Impact. Welt's main job is what I like to call turn order disruption. Some of you may have heard the term speed is king in an RPG, and while that is true, that doesn't mean that there is only one way to obtain it. Most characters, especially those DPS related, will focus on increasing their own speed or ally speed in order to move ahead of the enemies. Welt actually does something of the opposite. His basic attack is going to be used as a skill point generator, dealing a minimum of 50% imaginary damage to any single enemy. His skill and ultimate are really where the heroism lies. Edge of the Void is Welt's skill that slashes a random enemy up to 3 times, dealing imaginary damage equal to 36 to 79% of his attack stat to them. On hit, there is a 65% or 77%, depending on how much of the talent level you increase, base chance to reduce the enemy speed by 10% for 2 turns. Now pay attention, because that base chance percentage is what you'll really want to focus on the most. However, before diving into that, I have to mention his ultimate, which is an AoE attack with a 100% base chance for all enemies hit by this ability to be imprisoned. They go into jail. That's the easiest way to explain it. I have jailed my enemies. But for an actual definition, imprison basically means your turn gets skipped and you can't move. The technical terms behind it means their actions are delayed by 32 to 41% and the speed is reduced by 10%. And yes, to my knowledge, both the skill and ultimate speed reduction stack. Now that also pairs perfectly with his passive talent, which deals additional imaginary damage as high as 66% to enemies that have already been slowed. As I mentioned earlier, the main job of Welt is to completely hinder your enemies as much as possible, by removing their ability to act in the first place. For those that are lucky, unlucky, or you just happen to have balled out, Welt's Eidolons are interesting enough to look into. E1 will enhance his abilities after using his ultimate. This means that for the next 2 times he uses his basic attack or skill, Welt will deal additional damage to the target equal to 50% of his base attack or 80% of his skill's damage multiplier, respectively, of course. E2 regenerates more energy each time his talent is triggered, and that talent is going to come into play with these slowing enemies down and doing more imaginary damage to them. E4 is kind of cool. After using his ult, there is a 100% base chance to increase the damage received by the target by 12% for 2 turns. This is more than likely where you're gonna want to stop pulling for Welt now. It's okay. You've got a very powerful Welt. You're good. You don't need any more Eidolons. Stop pulling. However, for the sake of finishing this video the right way, E6 is basically a flex. This is going to add a 4th slash to his imaginary skill, Edge of the Void. But his basic kit alone isn't enough to ensure that this happens every single time, this being the slowdown effect and his ability to hinder the opponent. Let's look into fixing that. First, let's take a look at Welt's options for his best light cones. The obvious best in slot will be his signature 5-star light cone, In the Name of the World, which focuses on increasing Welt's damage to debuffed enemies. If you can't tell by now, doing things to debuffed enemies or slowed enemies is basically his thing. The reason this light cone is the best is because of the secondary attribute though, which automatically increases the effect hit rate and attack percent by 20%. So while this light cone is amazing, and if you just happen to get it, your Welt will be that much more helpful and technically powerful, but it's not so easily attainable for everyone, and that's kind of why I don't want to recommend it. But if you get it, you got the best Welt in the game. Good Night, Sleep Well, and Eyes of the Prey are your next best options for Welt, and if I'm being honest, just a little tidbit here, Good Night, Sleep Tight would have been so much more of a, like, it would be a fire light cone name. I'm just saying, from now on, that's the name of the light cone. I don't care, I'm calling it that. So Good Night, Sleep Tight will basically be the first half of his signature light cone, increasing his damage dealt against debuffed enemies. Eyes of the Prey will focus on the second half, which in my opinion is the better weapon here. This focuses on the effect hit rate being increased, which means the 65% base chance to slow an enemy that I mentioned earlier increases to 85% at a base value. However, with this light cone being a 4-star, you know what that means. You can now superimpose this much easier than in the name of the world. Even obtaining one extra copy of Eyes of the Prey pushes your base chance from 65% to 90%, which is practically almost all the time. Now granted, if you're a VGC player like myself, when it comes to Pokemon, 90% is actually 5% because the percentages flip, but whatever, we don't talk about that here. Lastly, for those that are pulling Welt early game or re-rolling for Welt, your 3-star options will be Loop and Void. Loop being a lesser version of Good Night Sleep Tight, though its conditions are specifically to slowed enemies. Void being a lesser version of Eyes of the Prey without the DOT. Did I mention that Eyes of the Prey does DOT damage? Once you unlock relics and you're able to farm them, you'll want to get a solid 4-piece set of Wastelander of the Banditry Desert. This set will increase your imaginary damage by 10% while also increasing the wearer's crit rate against debuff enemies, which once again, it just means you're slowing them down. Anybody that takes a debuff, bam, crit rate goes up. Doubling that though, if the enemy is imprisoned, then the crit damage is further increased by 20%. I mean, honestly, it sounds like they made the Wastelander set exactly for Welt because there isn't another imaginary debuffing character that also imprisons enemies. He is quite literally the only one. Musketeer of Wild Wheat is okay, not something that I would recommend for an optimal Welt build, but if it's all you got, then go for it. Attack percent increase is always nice. Your planar ornaments will consist of choosing between Pan-Galactic Commercial Enterprise, Belobog of the Architects, and Fleet of the Aegis. Ageless, that's the word, ageless. Between all of these though, Pan-Galactic will be the best 2-piece set to grab, with Belobog and Fleet tying for whatever you want to prioritize enhancing on the team. Or substats that you're looking for will include effect hit rate, speed, energy regen rate, break, and imaginary. Now crit is fine if you're trying to build some type of like offensive damage dealing main DPS Welt, but Welt's job isn't to dish out DPS levels of damage. He's there to hinder the enemy for your main DPS. As I spoke on earlier, effect hit rate is going to be what increases that slow chance at a base 65%, trying to push it towards 100%. Your speed is so that you continue to be faster than the opponent so that you can keep them slowed down for the rest of your team to pummel into them. Energy regen rate is of course going to be towards your ultimate, which the more he gets, the more ultimates pop off. The more ultimates pop off, the more you imprison enemies, meaning what? Turn control, they can't move. Yay, we love when our opponent can't play the game. And then of course, last but not least would be the break and imaginary. Imaginary just increasing your natural damage, and break being the damage that you do once you break the enemies. Fun fact, there are a ton of enemies that are actually weak to imaginary, and Welt being the only imaginary character in the game, that makes him that much more rare / stronger. For team comps, as I mentioned earlier, Welt's job is to hinder the enemy. Thus, you'll want to place him on teams that utilize powerful DPS characters who can take advantage of enemies losing their turn. These will be strong characters like Yangxing, Zila, Dan Heng, Jing Yuan, Arlen, and Su Shang. There are other characters, of course, who can fill your main DPS role. This is just giving you a brief example of what's possible. Next, we can opt for a healer over a shielder. Shields are great, don't get me wrong, but for a moment, let's take into consideration the fact that we don't want Welt being targeted down for any reason. Someone like Bailu or Natasha can increase the team's survival without stealing so many skill points, and due to the healer set that they can wear, it will also give you a natural skill point at the start of the game, going from 3 to 4. Lastly, since Welt has taken the role of the debuffer, we can actually fill our final slot with a sub DPS character like Serval, Pela, or even Sampo. Sampo will let you stack more DOT damage, so be mindful of how you build the rest of your team. If I were looking for something that's a little bit more free to play as an option, I would probably build something along the lines of Su Shang, Welt, March 7th, and Natasha. Of course, you can flip any of these things so that you make whatever team you want, but the gist of it is you're looking for a main DPS Welt is going to be the sub DPS in this case, and the other two are going to help support whatever's going on the team. Now, if you want something like full speed control, you could probably replace that other support with Asta. So now you're looking at something like main DPS, in this case, Sushong, Welt being your sub DPS, and then Asta being your support, and last being March 7th or Natasha, since they're both going to be free. And if you really wanted to ball out and you wanted something that was just completely dominating the game, well, I'm not going to lie to you, I don't have that. So we're just going to say Himiko and Welt makes the ultimate team because mommy Dami. With all of that said, Welt was one of the characters I wanted the least during the final beta, but I ended up getting him anyway, and I was honestly blown away by how much more effective he made my team gameplay. The ability to steal enemy turns is something that all of you will quickly find imperative in Honkai Star Rail. So I beg the question, what character should I cover next?